Morning, good evening if anyone is joining us from the global north, and definitely good evening for rest of the people who are joining from the global south. Greetings on behalf of IAMCR Journalism Research and Education section. It is really a privilege and honor for IAMCR to be partner for this historic conclave, which is being hosted by GMEC. To be very honest, I am hugely inspired by the initiative. So congratulations to the entire GMEC team, the executive board for organizing this conclave. I'm very privileged to be part of this conclave today with a keynote speech on media and marginalized, something which is quite broad in the spectrum. So when we talk about media as an institution, it is something which is underpinned by actors. So who are the actors? We do have journalists, media professionals, citizen journalists, bloggers, technological actors who are programmers, who are working as a digital journalism, news ecology actors. So other than actors, we have to look into agency that describe the actual marginalization caused by the media. So when we think about the issue of media and marginalization, it is something bifold, in my opinion. Marginalization can be occurred with the actors who uphold media as an institution. And at the same time, it can be caused by those actors. So before I touch upon the focused presentation today, let me explain a little bit how this marginalization operate within the context of news media ecologies across the globe. Journalists as an actor within journalistic institution can be part of this marginalization because of their ethnicity, religion, caste, or simply because of their gender. At the same time, they can be the cause of marginalizing communities because they are the constructor of reality. And being the constructor of reality, they can be the catalyst who trigger marginalization in broader societal perspective. But today, I'm not going to talk about how journalists as active actors or passive actors cause communities to be marginalized in any society. Rather, I prefer to focus on how journalists being active or passive actors can be marginalized within their own respective news media ecology. So having said that, as I said that marginalization can be occurred on the basis of caste, ethnicity, religion, but it can be massively happen because of the gender. And this is something which is an ongoing contemporary research issue when we call gendered journalistic practice. It indicates how journalists are marginalized because of their gender. And being a woman, I feel that it is something very pertinent to talk about how women journalists are marginalized within news media ecologies and regardless of the cultural context within which they operate. So starting with the presentation that women in news media, why their safety, rights, and representation matter. This question is something which is broadly linked with the marginalization of women journalists. And as I said, across the globe, there is no cultural differences when we address about the issue of women journalist safety, rights, and representation. There might be some variation based on the differences of global north and global south, definitely. But this is something, a pertinent issue that has triggered research and dialogue into gendered journalistic practices and to have a gender sensitive approach while addressing issues of women journalists. So when we say that women in news media, their safety, their rights, and their representation matters. Why? Because we want to make sure that men and women, they have equal representation, they have equal rights, and as well as an equally safe environment. So there is no prevalent discrimination that can cause marginalization of any submissive gender. So the issue of safety, rights, and representation for women journalists matters to ensure that they are not marginalized. So this is something that we need to address, because in countries like South Asia, in regions like South Asia, which are characterized, pardon me if you find it a wrong observation, they are characterized by news ecologies which are dominant by male journalists. And henceforth, the research into women rights, women safety, women representation, and news media ecologies become more triggered and more intriguing to see how they are actually marginalized. So something that I would like to look into deeper. Why specifically to talk about a female journalist safety? Is safety is not something which is important for a male journalist? Definitely yes. We have seen that South Asia has been constantly prone to conflict. It's a conflict sensitive region. Journalists who are engaged in reporting on conflict and war, particularly in regions like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Middle East, they are constantly prone to physical risk, and which ultimately result in psychological risk. But why to emphasize on the safety of female journalists? Because if a woman journalist, if she's a war correspondent, if she's reporting on conflict, she is more prone to physical risk by virtue of her gender. So having said that, we don't mean that we undermine women journalists because of their gender, but it is something their sensitivity of the safety risks trigger, it enhances because of their gender. So when we emphasize that we want to ensure a safe working environment for female journalists, it means that we want to facilitate their participation in journalistic ecology at least equally to male journalists. Now, in countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and in Nepal, we see that most of the journalists who report on conflict and war, they are male journalists. And most of the female reporters, they are not assigned to report on conflict and war simply because they are considered as someone who cannot cope with the violence, who cannot cope with the safety hazard involved in these kind of reportings. So ensuring a safe environment, facilitating their pitch into war zone or conflict areas means that we are giving them a space to have equal representation in covering sensitive issues or conflict issues in conflict sensitive areas. I'm sure if you look at dynamics of female journalists back to India, they are not too much into conflict or war zone reporting. It is being dominated by male journalists. And definitely, I'm sure like recently we have worked together with UNESCO South Asia's cluster office in New Delhi, who have been very active to promote conflict sensitive reporting and the representation of men and women journalists equally to take part in reporting into conflict zone and conflict areas of South Asia. So these kind of initiatives help women journalists to at least ensure their representation, that they are part of a news media ecology, they are not marginalized. Now, in many of the UNESCO sessions, we emphasize specific and specialized training sessions for male journalists and female journalists from a gender-sensitive approach, so that we train women journalists how they can take part in conflict areas or war zones, ensuring their safety and ensuring that they are also part of these sensitive beat areas. So ensuring and emphasizing safety of female journalists is one way to ensure that they are not marginalized. But it is not certainly the part of female journalist safety. There are so many other issues that does affect their marginalization, that does affect their professional development. And one of the very pertinent issue is about gender discrimination. Now, gender discrimination is something which is common in the global north as well as global south, but it does vary because of the cultural or religious variation of different countries. Now, if you look at the specific case of South Asia, we can see that female journalists, they are more discriminated in terms of their recruitment, their promotion, their pay scale. However, we must acknowledge that in recent years, there has been a tremendous increase of female journalists across South Asia. You can see that more and more female journalists, they are entering into journalistic profession, regardless of the challenges they might confront. But still the issue of discrimination in recruitment, in pay scale, in promotions does exist. And we need to address that to make sure that women are not marginalized, to make sure that their professional growth is not affected by gender disparity in different aspects. Another issue is about the digital risk. As I said, that journalists are prone to physical and psychological risk, regardless of their gender. Male and female journalists, they both encounter offline safety risk. But having said that, we are surviving in a digital ecology. Female journalists, they are more prone to digital risk of sexual harassment, online trolling, and online threats. And that is something that goes under the carpet. At times, they are not able to report back effectively, even to their media organizations or to their colleagues, that what sort of sexual harassment, online trolling, and what kind of specific threats they are facing through social media and other digital platforms. Though with the heralding of Me Too movement across the globe, we have seen that quite many women journalists are courageous enough to report back what exactly they face in the online world, in online sphere. But still, we must acknowledge the cultural context of South Asia, where women journalists, they are not simply able to speak up what exactly they face in terms of digital risk. So this is something that needs a deeper investigation to make sure that women journalists, they are not leaving behind because of any sort of online and offline safety risk. And then I put sexual harassment in a separate box. Now, why? Is sexual harassment not a safety risk? It is. But why we need to address sexual harassment of women journalists separately? Now, let me tell you that we have been currently running a research project that looks into the concept of sexual harassment in different countries of the world. Sexual harassment has journal definition that has been defined by United Nations. We have generic definitions that have been defined by UNESCO. But at the same time, the preliminary findings of our research project back to Latin America and South Asian countries indicate that sexual harassment is a concept that is relative. It is subjected to the cultural or the context within which a female journalist operates. Now, for example, if a female journalist operating back to Pakistan and if somebody operating back to India, it's something very interesting how women journalists conceptualize and perceive sexual harassment that might be different. And this is the ground or the underpinning of my current research project to gauge how female journalists perceive or conceptualize sexual harassment, how it affects their professional and personal lives. It helps us to understand the way they can be marginalized because of sexual harassment. Now, I can share briefly some of the key findings from Latin America or South Asian countries like Pakistan, that sexual harassment is something which can be conceptualized in very, very funny ways, even within the same country. For example, if somebody is operating in an English language news media, they might have different understanding of sexual harassment than somebody working in an Urdu language news media. Similarly, if you go back to Latin America, they have these kind of variations in the conceptions of sexual harassment, the way they perceive. The language does define the language of media, the orientation of media. Some media organizations, they are rightist, some are leftist in their orientation. These kind of variation may persist within the same countries, and we need to minutely address how female journalists conceptualize and pervade sexual harassment to understand exactly how it affects their professional development. Because we cannot apply a universal definition of sexual harassment. We do have documents from United Nations that we use as an underpinning of a conceptual framework of our research project, but based on the grounded theory approach, we encourage to build a framework that does take into account contextual and cultural differences. This is how we understand exactly how women journalists are marginalized. And then we need to take into account the broader societal and cultural context. When we talk about South Asia, it looks like something quite similar. But trust me, even within South Asia, countries like India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Maldives, Bhutan, they all have different societal texture. They may have similarities. They may share some cultural or contextual common underpinnings, but they do have different cultural intricacies that we need to gauge. For example, a woman journalist operating back to North India, she might have a different level of pressure. She might have a different experience, the one who is operating in South India. Similarly, female journalists operating in Pakistan, 4 different provinces, they might have different experiences based on their ethnic, cultural, or tribal background. So we need to look into cultural intricacies. We need to look into these variables, how it marginalizes women journalists. So the marginalization of women in media, it is triggered by several factors. As I mentioned in this PowerPoint slide, it may be triggered by gender discrimination within news media. It may be triggered by offline and online safety risk. It may be triggered by the prevailing sexual harassment at different levels, and it may be triggered by the broader societal and contextual factors. Another important aspect that we need to take into consideration regarding the marginalization of women in news media ecology is the emerging challenge of gender disinformation. Now, very recently, there has been growth into research that talks about gender disinformation that does impact women politicians and women journalists. Earlier, we used to talk about the stereotypes that does affect female journalist representation, their identity, their self-esteem, their dignity within news media. But now it has been more focused with gender disinformation. So what exactly gender disinformation is? Gender disinformation directly or indirectly does affect the reputation, the image, self-esteem, dignity of a woman politician or a woman journalist. So in one sense, it is a subtle, indirect, or at times in aggressive context, a direct attempt to malign the identity of a woman. And I should rather say the professional identity of a woman journalist. For example, if you claim woman journalist, she's corrupt, she's involved in sexual affairs, and she is not professional, she is simply not competent enough in her profession, in professional duties, these kind of disinformation impacts on the professional development of a woman journalist, and that ultimately impacts on the marginalization of women journalists. So what we need to do is we need to ensure that this kind of disinformation does not affect female journalists, but at the same time, I emphasize it does not affect even male journalists, because male journalists, they can also be a victim of disinformation. So this is not something which is specific to gender, given I'm focusing right now on female journalists, how they are marginalized. But trust me, gender disinformation can impact male journalists equally. Now, you might have thousands of examples in your respective countries, the way journalists are blamed being corrupt, being involved in sexual affairs, being involved in different kind of malign activities, and at the same time, questions on their professional credibility and competency. It does impact male and female journalists equally. But given that female journalists, we need to encourage more to get them involved in broader news media ecology. We need to ensure that this kind of gender disinformation does not harm their professional development. So having said that we know that the issue of safety, the issue of rights, the issue of gender disinformation does impact the professional development of female journalists. It does impact their It does define their marginalization within any media institution. What we can do exactly to address these issues. So the first approach is to have a multi-stakeholder approach, which is definitely comes originally from UNESCO and United Nations, who constantly emphasize to involve different stakeholders to address pertinent issues. And when we say to have multi-stakeholder approach, that means to involve national governments, media organizations, journalist unions, civil society members, all together at one platform to address these issues. And then we need to have concentrated efforts to develop a legal framework to address the issue of female journalist safety, their gender disinformation, and gender disparity. I'm sure in across South Asia, all countries have different kind of legal instruments to ensure workplace harassment, to ensure online and offline safety of female journalists. But what we need is to ensure effective implementation of these laws. Another important aspect is to encourage women journalists to underline their issues. This is one of the issues that I always face in my research project, is to encourage women journalists to speak up their experiences with honesty. Not all the time do female journalists, they are ready to take part to talk about their experiences of sexual harassment and the way they experience different kind of safety risk online and offline. And this is one thing that we really need to encourage, that women journalists, they come up and they ensure that their voice is being heard. And finally, given that I'm one of the people who advocate for research in every aspect of media and communication, I encourage people to please look into deeper aspect, develop new conceptual, innovative theoretical framework that we do need to address pertinent issues. I'm grateful to all of you for bearing me, and I hope that this is something insightful, and I'm very looking forward to our next speakers to enlighten with their deliberations. Thank you.